Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of the Narrow Fastcast. Thanks so much for listening. And today's episode is going to be about a phrase that I heard from someone called Lane Norton, who's quite a big guy in the fitness world. And he said, "What gets monitored gets changed." And I thought that was something really interesting because it tends to only be when you're unwell, you get monitored for your health. So if you start to feel poorly, you then go to the GP. The GP might do some bloods and they might say, oh, you're anemic, or you've got this, you've got that. But we never monitor ourselves when we're well to prevent us becoming unwell. So we're very proactive when, and being reactive. So medicine's great when we are unwell. It's just that I think the shift of focus really needs to go from doing lots of things when we're unwell to how do we do regular things, small things regularly, but often to prevent ourselves and mitigate that inevitable aging process, but then does come with it, usually with age-related illnesses for most of us. So it really sort of got me thinking, because all the time it's all about what you're being monitored for now you're poorly, and we're obsessed with monitoring. Once you become unwell, we are obsessed with monitoring you. Every year you come back for, your kidney function, your blood pressure, liver function. We want to look at your cholesterol. We want to look at your, glucose levels in your blood. What about people that are just going along not feeling 100%? Well, we never monitor you. And that's when it comes down to you having to be proactive at monitoring yourself. Now, I know lots of people I speak to about wearables and which are things like, your watches, the Garments and stuff like that. I've got one on at the moment. And people say, I can become quite obsessive with it and it doesn't really tend to benefit me. So I always like to think about all these different things is like an input and output. And it's like, okay, well, you've already said that there's something that you want to change. But if you're not prepared to change your input, the output of that is still going to stay the same. And I think what it comes down to is monitoring actually gives you accountability. And I think there's a real scary thing is sometimes when you start something, you become so attached to, like fasting, for example, you could become so attached to that being entrenched in your identity about who you are and what you do, but maybe it's horrifically bad for you. Maybe actually it's not what you need to be doing. Maybe a keto diet just isn't, it makes you look good, but maybe it's just not very healthy for you. And I think before we become attached to these ideas, I think it's a good metric just to sort of have this kind of checklist almost to sort of think, well, okay, let's think about the fundamentals of what I'm trying to achieve. Okay, do I wake up in the morning with energy? Can I go to sleep okay? Can I do a moderate amount of exercise without becoming too tired and exacerbated and, being injured from it? Am I aroused? Because being sexually aroused is a good indicator for kind of stress levels and just general basic functions, because it's such a procreation is sort of why we're really here. How is my mental health? How is my ability to go to the toilet? Do I react to certain things in terms of, do I have lots of food allergies? Do I have lots of inflammation going on? Do I am in pain when I walk? Am I able to just do general basic functions well? Because the problem is what we kind of do is we kind of go, I'm going to start running. And then it's like, oh, you're going to do an ultra marathon. And we're like, no, I'm just going to start running because I want to start running. And I think the problem is that we kind of always compare what we set out to do to, are we going to be the best all the time? And it's not always until you kind of, the monitoring you've got, which I find is all really interesting, is I've had an injury for the last 2-3 months. My shoulder, and I've still slightly got it. But once the injury went, and I realised what it was like to have a normal shoulder that didn't wake me up 3-4 times at night, I was like, do you know what? Being just normal, not having massive shoulders, not having huge kind of muscles and being out paddleboarding and all this type of stuff. Do you know what? Just actually going to bed and not being in pain is so good. It's like the bar of how good that feels and just how important that is for my everyday life. Not every time I go, want to get something out of the cupboard, I'm like, oh, my shoulder again. I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. And I think sometimes we miss this. Sometimes we miss being just as good enough as that we can be in our own skin, in the sense of it's like, I'm feeling really good at myself. And you kind of take your top off and you're like, well, he's not got a six pack. So what does it mean? And you kind of go, actually, if you tick a lot of those boxes and you're doing well at what you're doing, then actually that's more beneficial. And I feel like the monitoring side comes in, it always rechecking back to how does that make me feel. And I think what's really important about sort of what gets monitored gets changed is that I think you need to be your own scientist for your own life. And I feel that, like they say, research is the best form of research, because I can sit here, and we have done in the past, and talked about how, intermittent fasting could be really good for your health. Yeah, cool. Good for lots of people. People find it really beneficial. But ultimately, there's two things to this. One, that if I say I'm doing 18 hours of fasting today, and you do 18 hours of fasting, you say it makes me feel rubbish, then clearly that's not good for you. Or clearly you maybe need to try some things like what you eat before you fast. Maybe that might help. Maybe you take some electrolytes and things like that. Or ultimately, it just might be too long for you. Or maybe you're not getting the right benefit. Maybe you need to go longer. Or maybe fasting doesn't work for you. And I think what it needs to do is you need to sort of like take this information you hear from podcasts and people like me and actually just apply it to that sort of simple input-output equation. If I change these inputs, does my output change in what I want to be like? And again, that comes down to, well, what do I want to feel like? And then is that input that's coming in actually adding to how I want to feel at the end of it? And if it isn't, then stop it and change it. But there is one key consistency to all of this. And this basically is time and consistency. So nothing that you implement in your life will ever excel or really work unless you put those two things to it. Again, and a lot of people would say, well, you also need to have like passion for the change, and you also need to have like drive and motivation, things like that. Well, simply, like, a lot of people get up for work and they don't enjoy work, but they get up, they go to work. So the input is the actual attending work. They do their work. The output is they get paid. So if you stop going to work, you will then stop being paid. If you stop doing your job, whether you're self-employed or you're employed, ultimately, if you stop doing it, the outcome stops. And it's the same principle if you applied it to the reverse that and say, well, if I change that, then the output's going to be completely different. And again, the monitoring thing I think is so important, because if you were to look at this from a different perspective and you would say, right, I want to end up with 10 grand in the bank account at the end of the year. Okay. Now, if you said, right, I'm going to end up with 10 grand in the bank account at the end of the year, there's two things you can do. One is you can look at your bank account every single day and be accountable for every decision that you have when spending. Okay. So that means that you're monitoring it regularly, and you're then doing a risk to benefit for every time you spend. So you kind of go, right, well, I could buy this new top, but it means then I've got next week, I've only got X amount because I've spent what I can allow to do this week. So monitoring and budgeting, really important things. And then if you do that every day, I can probably guarantee that you're going to hit that £10,000 saving at the end of the year. Versus if you didn't look at your savings once and just got to the end of the year and were like, da-da, and you're probably like, shit, I haven't actually saved anything. So I think this is where the monitoring thing becomes important. Now, again, if we're talking about sort of like weight loss, for example, if you said to go on the scales every day, and sometimes for people that can be triggering, that people have eating disorders and things like that. So, of course, you've got to be careful with that. But in general, if you think about it, if you were really pushed to improve something in your life and weight was a metric, then surely the only metric to worry about is how much does the needle on that weight scale move, versus then you kind of can correlate that to the input, and then the output is the number on the scale. So you kind of go, well, if I'm doing all this, like, I don't know, exercise and fasting and stuff like this, and my output is that the weight's going down, then surely, and I feel good, then surely you just keep going with that. And that just then comes back to the consistency and time thing. The problem is we don't have, when it comes to sort of change and monitoring, we just have such a short time horizon for it. And it really goes back to a few things where, unless you don't know what you don't know. So if you don't know that something's not going right in your body, you can't change it. So a few years ago, probably about 3 years ago, I really changed my fasting. I really went to being really religious with it no milk in my coffees. I really kind of made sure that I wasn't having like sugar-free, like, I don't know, sugar-free mint or something like that in my fasting window that actually had carbohydrate in it. And I just cut it all out. And I didn't realise how better I felt after actually being consistently good with it over a long enough time horizon. And then what happened was, when we come back to the wearables, I was sort of thinking, okay, well, it's interesting because now I'm like changing my diet up. So I went from vegetarian, which I was getting loads of bloatedness and bowel problems and feeling horrific. And I was like, okay, so I'm gonna like go to animal based, because Josh at the time was doing animal based. I thought maybe that might be really good. And I started using a lot of honey and things like that for my carbohydrate, trying to avoid having kind of more processed carbohydrate in my diet. And I thought to myself, well, honey is really sugary, so actually maybe that's not a great thing to eat quite a bit of. But I was just like, well, how do I know unless I monitor it? Like, I don't know what it does for my blood sugars unless I monitor it, right? So I put a continuous blood glucose monitor on, and I kind of realised that doesn't really, I can have 2 full spoonfuls of honey, it doesn't spike my glucose. Now, there's a counter argument for about, fructose is being a source because it's only metabolized by the liver, and it can lead to excess non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. But in general, I was like, well, I feel good on it. I feel much better than if I was to have like bread. Doesn't spike my blood glucose levels, and it fills me up because I feel like I've got enough glycogen and energy in my muscles when I do exercise. So I kind of go, well, my input's honey, my outputs I feel really good, and I don't feel bloated and I don't feel horrible after having it. I've also monitored it, so I kind of know that it's actually not spiking blood glucose levels and it's not leading me to have higher baseline glucose. And you kind of go, well, adding that all together kind of works for me. And I think that it's the same thing when it comes to like trying sleep habits and stuff like that. Ultimately, the biggest determinant really of how your sleep changes work is if you wake up and feel like rested. If you don't, then if your watch tells you you've had 18 hours of sleep but you still feel horrific, then irrespective of your sleep cycles and things like that, you kind of need to be doing something, whether it's the fact that you're waking up and you've had a habit of waking up after sleep and going straight to social media, and that then changing your mindset as soon as you wake up. But something has to change, whether it's maybe the sleep is perfect but actually you're still feeling like that, so your input needs to change because your output isn't where it wants to be. Do you see what I'm saying? I feel like every single time it goes back to, well, the output. What is the output? Like at the moment, I'm getting up at 5:45 to train for our paddleboarding. So we're paddleboarding across the channel from Great Ormond Street, and we've been accepted by Guinness World Records to set the world record for stand-up paddleboarding across the channel. And I'm very aware that I need to also train for it. So I'm getting up in the morning, 5:45, and it's probably this week is the first week after about a month of doing it that I've actually been able to get out of bed, feel like I can get out, walk downstairs with some clothes on, go outside and start training. And most mornings I'll be waking up and being like, oh, I feel horrific. Now the problem is, one is I didn't do it over a long enough time horizon. 2, I know that I had to be consistent with it. So about 2 weeks ago, come Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, when I don't need to get up in the mornings, I was doing it a bit later, and it just completely ruined it. And again, once I've gone back to being really consistent with it, then my level of energy in the morning and how quickly I get to my workout, I don't spend 15 minutes faffing. I'm straight into my workout, and I feel so much better for it. Now, I can sit here and say all these different things, but I think ultimately you need to do a few things, and this is something that I've really learned in lots of different areas of my life. One is you need to listen to people that are where you want to be in your life. So, for example, if you take this as like a money analogy, if you want to be earning £10,000 a month, you go to someone that's earning £10,000 a month, and you get them to break it down into stages of where they started, how they scaled up something like a business to get to there, and then how they maintain it. If you go and speak to someone that's doing £100 a month, then the advice you're going to get will not resonate or won't even be as beneficial to the person that's already doing what you're doing, or even going to someone that's doing £1 million a month, because their perspective on how you make a change and all the ups and downs that you go through will be far better than any of those people blur. Because, and the same thing about your health, if you're going to go to talk to someone that's lost 10 pounds, but your goal is to lose 50 pounds, or they've lost 10 kilograms and you need to lose 20 kilograms, then what it means is you're going to be resonating with the mindset of where they are at the ceiling of where they need to be. Okay, what you want to do is you want to go find someone that's had the mindset and the change and determination and all of the things they've put in place to go beyond where they are. And I think this is the thing, if you can visit people, you can surround yourselves by people. And this is why they say when you comes to sort of making changes in your life, you almost need to reinvent who you are. And I've got this really interesting story that really resonates with me. Was I used to work in Plymouth at a pharmacy that you see hundreds of people a day for pickups of methadone and buprenorphine. So most people were recovering heroin addicts. And there's one guy there that I remember really well. He's a lovely guy. He used to come in for a weekly pickup, which is always a good sign. So it means they're sort of, when they have like urine screens, things like that, they're normally quite clean, they're normally very adherent, and they're normally quite focused on their recovery. Excuse me. So this guy came back. Normally, he smells good, was well dressed, he sort of carried himself very well, he's usually relatively polite. And I sort of said to him, "Oh, are you okay?" And he said, "Oh, no." He said, I am doing really well, but I lost my job." And he was doing some washing up dishes and stuff like that in a restaurant. And I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry." And he said, "Yeah." So he's like, "Not only have I lost my job, I've got nowhere to live," because he lost his house as well, because he lost his job. And he's like, "Now I'm homeless." And I said, "Oh, you're going to go to the Salvation Army?" And he said, "Yeah, I am, but I'm going to go get a tent." And I was like, "Right, so what are you getting a tent for?" He said, "Because I'm going to sleep in a car park." And I was like, "Well, why are you sleeping in a car park?" I mean, this guy came in, smelled brilliant, looked great. You would never have known that he was a recovering heroin addict that was homeless for 4 years, not like less than a year ago. I mean, you would not have a clue. And he said, "Well, because if I go back to the Salvation Army, I'm going to be surrounded by the people." And he says, once you're surrounded by other heroin addicts offering it to you, he said, it's so difficult to resist that temptation to go back to who you are. And I find that sometimes when you make a change in your life, you sometimes need to break away from who you were and create a new you to become this new version of you. Because if you've got one foot in the door or one foot in the past, people make comments and people will reward you for certain things and behaviours you used to do because it makes them feel good, because they're not watching someone else hold a mirror up to their behaviours of that, well, I'd like to change like that, but I can't. So how can I pull this person back not to do that? Do you see what I mean? And it was just always stuck in me that he would rather sleep in a tent in a car park than sleep in a bed in a dorm, in a room in a house, because he didn't want to become who he was. And I feel that's an extreme example, but sometimes I feel like we really do need to let go of who we are to become who we can become. And I think that's something that's really, really important. And I think that sometimes that ends up putting friction in relationships, whether that's marital relationships or partners and friendships. But sometimes if they do have the best love and intention for you, they will hopefully grow and change with you, which is why it's quite lovely when I see dad or mum gets diagnosed with diabetes, or they're overweight, or they do that and they make a change, but the whole family comes along with them and they make this big change together. And you don't just see one person excel and change in their life, you see the whole family kind of grow and change. I think it's a really important thing to do. And I think it's also really important, like you said before, not to marry yourself to one thing, to be adaptable, because bodies change, lifestyles change, situations change. And maybe the thing that you used to do, that used to give you your identity, you might not be able to do anymore. Maybe you have an injury, or maybe something happens. And I think it's important to just change the direction of what you think. Because what a lot of people do is they also go, "Oh, in my 20s, I used to do this and I felt great." And you're kind of like, "Yeah, that's right, but you're 50. So that's not you anymore." So you need to sort of find out what works for you like now in your 50s, because what people do is they go back and they say, "Oh, I did keto, or I did this, or I played squash 3 times a week, and I'm doing that now, and it's not getting the weight off. And you're like, because your body's different. You've done 20 years, 30 years of doing the wrong things to your body and expecting it to go back to your 20s and perform when you hadn't had 30 years of damaging or 30 years of doing the wrong things. And the other thing is there's a few things like your attention, your health flows where your attention goes. And I think that's really important. Like, you see successful people, and whether that's at achieving success in work or achieving success in their life, and you always kind of go, oh, look at where they are. And what we forget is a few things. One is that their attention on to what they want to achieve has probably been going on for a long time, and you end up seeing people at the top of the mountain. And what we don't do is, rather than we stare at the top in awe, and we kind of go, okay, well, is that where I want to be? Because we said before, we kind of go, do I want to be, a Mr. Olympia? And if you kind of go, no, then you kind of go, cool, okay, well, what's my mountain going to look like? Okay, it's here. How long do I reasonably think it's going to take to get there so I can achieve my outcome in a realistic time frame? And I think once we start looking at it like that, you kind of go, okay, so in 2 years' time, it's reasonable for me to think that I'm going to have a 6-pack and 20-inch arms. Okay, cool. So that means that if I haven't achieved it in 6 months, I'm not going to be upset, because I know that I'm going to commit 2 years to get to that point. And I know that I've got to work during that period consistently to achieve that goal. And I think once you sort of start breaking things down and then into smaller goals, things just become more achievable. And I feel that once we sort of stop looking at the constant end result of what everyone's achieved and they can post up on Instagram and things like that, because a lot of the time you're looking at different genetics, you're looking at people that have been doing this for 10 years, and some people can look at weight and just put muscle, some people look at weight and put muscle on. Some other people, it takes hours and hours and hours to do it. I struggle to put weight on. Other people don't struggle to put weight on. But then it makes it easier to put weight on, build muscle, and then lose fat than it does when you struggle to put weight on first. And so that's something that I personally find really difficult. I struggle to get above 80 kilograms. I've tried for 4 months now, and I struggle, no matter how much I eat, I cannot get above 80 kilograms. But I put 4 kilograms on, and reasonably, I thought in 6 months I would be up to 85 kilograms. So in 4 months, I've got to 80 kilograms. So I've got halfway to where I need to be. So maybe that's an unrealistic goal, and maybe my horizon should be bigger. So, and just to sort of really kind of, I think just to finish off, is that excuse me, that monitoring these things is not a case of getting obsessive. But recently, there's someone that I knew that has recently been diagnosed with cancer, and previous to that, he was doing jiu-jitsu, he was exercising, he was fasting, he was incredibly well. I mean, you wouldn't have had a clue that he had lung cancer. And he's only young. And what it really kind of reminded me is that he was going along and felt absolutely nothing until he got pneumonia, which is what he thought was pneumonia. And it actually been a build-up of kind of fluid on his lungs, which he had drained off, and he felt fine now. He's out, he was out of ICU in a day. He was, out rucking and out doing all these insane things. He's got the most amazing kind of drive and attitude towards life. But he had lung cancer in himself for quite a long time that would have been growing before he even knew. And it just goes back to us not to be obsessed with things, but sometimes it is good to monitor some things to make sure that we are where we, to monitor that we are okay, and not wait until some catastrophic thing to then think, oh my God, I need to do something about it now. If you slowly chip away at a problem that you've got, or that becomes highlighted, then it just gives you tools and resources to either buy, to invest in, to change, that might help you to prevent becoming seriously ill later on in life. Because for me personally, life for how long you live is important, that sort of lifespan is important, but I feel that how well you are during that, if I can be healthy and mobile at 80, that's what I want to do. I don't mind getting to 70, but being really, really healthy and fit up into 70. What scares me is getting to 70 and then being, in a wheelchair, or being so unhealthy I couldn't get myself out of a chair for the next 10, 15 years. So each time I hit an age bracket, I'm thinking, cool, can I maintain the fitness, the fitness, the mindset, and everything that I've got now, my lifestyle, for the next 10 years, to hopefully be when I'm there in 10 years' time, I look back and go, cool, okay, can I do that again in another 10 years? And I think if that's the case, then stick to what you're doing. If it's not, and you're not where you want to be, think about where you're going to be in the next 10 years. And go back to that input and what's the output. If that needs to change, then just start monitoring some things and start with something really basic. It's interesting. I do this quite a bit with patients. I'm like, what would make you unwell? And they'd say, well, okay, I would not exercise, I would smoke, I'd drink, I would eat junk food, I would do this. And I'm like, okay, cool. So how many of those things do you do? And they're like, well, I do drink a bit, only a little bit. Okay. And I suppose I don't exercise very much. Do eat quite a bit of junk food. My sleep's really bad. And then you go, okay, cool. So if you then reverse engineered that and said, okay, so if you did the opposite of everything that you said that would make you unwell, then surely doing the reverse of all those things would then make you well. And they're like, yeah, I suppose it would do. And you're like, okay, fine, don't change anything. Just change the things that you said you're doing that makes you unwell first. And then add in things like fasting if it makes good, add in HIIT training, add in eating more protein, add in doing all these other things first. But realistically, go back. And then you go back to, well, I don't know what to eat. Okay, what would you eat to make you unwell? Crisps, chips, bread all the time, sweet things, sugar. Okay, cool. So if you took those things, you write them all down, and then you kind of took all those things out of your diet, and then you went shopping, but you're like, I can shop, I can buy stuff, but I just got to make sure I cut that out. And again, you're not saying you can't eat certain things. You're just saying, well, look, you've made your own list of things make you feel, that probably going to make you feel unwell. So just don't eat those. And then you kind of go, well, I can shop and buy anything else. And then you go, cool, right, well, where are we in 6 months? Yeah, 3 months' time. Oh, we're much better. Okay, cool. All right. I like much better in terms of, are you where you want to be? Yeah. How consistent have you been with it? All these types of things. Then you can kind of go again. I think sometimes it is just about being actually mindful of certain things, making that change. And the key is consistency. So hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, and really appreciate it that you've come on and listened today. If there's anyone else you think would benefit from it, please share it. We are always very, very grateful for everyone that watches and everyone that shares our stuff. Have a great day.